Let's see. I want to take a few minutes to talk about something. So maybe you noticed there was an election a day or two ago, and I I do try very hard not to display any partisanship in this class because that's not my job. That's not my expertise. I have none. But I do know that several of you are fairly traumatized by what happened and worried and upset and things like that. So I want to be, if it's okay, Grace, I want to be a little reassuring, I hope. Okay. I mean, I know that trope about the arc of history tends to go in one direction, right? But, I've seen it. So I remember when the Supreme Court said states could no longer prevent people from getting married in interracial marriages. And you would not believe the uproar over such a thing. Where are those people now? Well, most of them are dead, thank God. And there might be some that still hold those views, but they're gone, right? They're not in the public market. Likewise, right? When the Supreme Court, a different Supreme Court, said that same-sex people could get married, again, there was an enormous uproar, and there had been setbacks. Just a few years before, the state of California had, refused to legalize same-sex marriages. A few years later, it's legalized, and who's speaking out against that now? Well, yes, of course, there are some folks, but so things do move in a different direction, right? It's not, and there have always been setbacks, and there are going to be more, and you're going to experience more. Again, without advocating who I think should have won, I know some of you are upset that we've yet to have a woman president, right? Trust me, in your lifetime, there will be a woman president. So these things, happen. And what I want to urge you to do, and I will be a little patriotic here for a moment, is however you feel about that election, here's what I feel confident is the very best thing you can do for your country today, right? Which is keep building the life you want, a happy, fulfilling life. Do that. Take care of yourself. Tend to your own garden, as Voltaire might have said, right? And make yourself, the happiest life you can. And I hope that your time here at MSU is an important way for you to work on that. Okay? So my advice, next few days, however you feel about the election, put your blinders on about that and keep your eye on the prize, right? And your prize is to make the life that you want. To the best of my knowledge, it's not like video games. You only get one, right? And it's your job to invest in it to make it as happy as you can make it. How's that? Okay. All right, enough old fart. So I want to remind you that this weekend is the third midterm, the quiz. And so it should be available to you starting at noon, and you have to complete it by the end of midnight on Sunday. And it's 100 multiple choice questions, just like before. And it is there are some review questions, but it is primarily from chapter 7 about apoptosis, chapter 7.5 about hormones, which we kind of went on to, about at quite a bit of length, and the interlude that I'm going to talk about today. Okay? So, but before we do that, questions about any of the material that we just went over. Anyone? Okay. All right. So, I did want to talk a little bit about the interlude. And by now you've probably noticed that there's something strange about this textbook that's so biology driven. right? Which is 3 times I interrupt to give a little mini lecture about philosophy, and not even recent philosophy, right? Philosophy that's 1,000 years old or a couple hundred years old at least. So this is one of those examples. And I want to give you an overview of how these philosophical ideas and concerns, how they fit into the program of how to put together a nervous system that will actually work, right? So up until this point, notice that everything that's been shaping the nervous system, the number of neurons, where they migrate to, what axons they send out, what connections they make, how many of them die, how they're shaped differently in males and females based on hormonal signals in mammals and based on genetic signals in flies. Notice that in all of this, there's been absolutely no opportunity for any sensory event to play a role. Why? Well, because the sensory organs aren't working yet, right? And so up to this point, everything that's gone, and let's ignore, of course, at any one time, there are plenty of embryos where things have gone wrong and they're doomed. But at this point in neural development, for every viable embryo that's out there, there's already a very complicated nervous system made, right? All the parts, all the kinds of cells, most of the major connections, they've all been put together and nobody told them how to do anything, right? How did that happen? Where was the information, where did the information come from that told them that caused all those things to unfold? Radio waves, internet, genes, right? No, and there can't have been a chance for, the state of the world, how bright the sky is, how cold it is outside. There hasn't been a chance for any of that stuff to have any influence on this decision. And we already have a highly structured nervous system. And so all of that, when that happened to you, right? All of that is thanks to your mom and dad. They gave you enough functional alleles that you could put all that stuff together without any instruction from anybody. Right? So, thanks, mom. Thanks, dad. Right? More ultimately, where did those genes come from that mom and dad got? Right? They arose through 1 billion years of evolution, and those alleles mostly got fixed upon, about 5 million years ago. Okay? So up to this point in your development, your very complex nervous system has been put together by following instructions that are 5 million years old, right? When Homo sapiens first arose in Africa. Now, to go back to Plato said, if I told this to Plato, he would say, I told you so. I told you there's no way for information, for people to have that much knowledge any way except having an eternal soul. But had he known about nucleotides and had he known about DNA, he would have said, okay, thanks. Now I know the soul's made out of DNA. All right, thanks a bunch. And DNA makes RNA and RNA makes protein. Okay. But I still hold it's eternal. And you'd say, oh, Plato, it's not eternal. It's only 5 million years old. And he'd look at you like your hair was on fire, right? From the perspective of a species that almost never lives to be 100 years, 5 million years might as well be eternal, right? And so you can see why his philosophy that Descartes furthered and developed more, you can see the appeal of that. And they were right. Right? They're right. There is an eternal soul. I mean, we're not going to give it a ghostly presence. We're going to, it's still material. But there is this ancient information that got your brains put together. And had very many of those instructions been lost, you would not be here, right? That would be the end of it. You'd get no further than that. So it's not just eternal, it's essential information if you're going to put together a well-formed nervous system. But what happened philosophically is that at a very important time in human civilization, and because it's best documented in Western civilization, that's where I know the most about it, where I think, in fact, we know the most about it. But it'll happen in the 1600s or so. What happens is a group of people arise who, remember, Descartes said he was going to ignore all Plato and just start all over, except almost everything he says is just Plato, rewritten slightly. But there arose a group of people who questioned everything. And one of the things they questioned was this idea that only the strong are to be in charge of everything. I'm going to focus on some British philosophers who, first of all, Henry VIII and that whole thing, he tried to break away from the Roman Catholic Church. He did, etc. And so here was the king, the guy that God said should be in charge of England. He was saying the church was wrong about something. And that was the start of a slippery slope, because then other people started saying, well, maybe all the churches are wrong about one thing or another. And so there came in Western Europe, there came this idea, people began to question whether kings and queens really did have the right to make every decision, reap all keep almost all the money that the country generated, and let everyone else have just enough to keep them from starving. So there was a lot of questions about royalty. And in England especially, there were several philosophers who arose who came to be known as empiricists, who were insisting that the way we know things about the world is from experience. And I want to talk about some of them. So generally the three that are seen as the most influential were David Hume, who I think was Irish, actually. And in some ways, he was really the biggest skeptic ever. He claimed to not really be sure whether the sun would rise tomorrow. You got to wait and see. And in his age, right? So remember, he dies about the time the American Revolution was getting started. In his day, he did something kind of dangerous, which was he was an ultimate agnostic. He may have been an atheist, but he was very careful never to say so. And indeed, it might have been hazardous to his health to say, I don't think there is a God. But he spent his whole life kind of skirting around the issue. And even on his deathbed, people are there trying to get him to acknowledge, that there's God, get forgiveness, go to heaven, all that stuff. And he just kind of shyly ignores them. And I guess he really liked good living. You can see with the clothes he chose to be painted in, etc. there. And I guess he really liked to eat and drink and all that. And the French fell in love with him. They didn't like very many Englishmen, but they loved Hume, and they called him Le Bon David. So, because he was such a good guy, etc. And so that's the idea of when I'm saying people are questioning everything. I don't know the sun's going to rise tomorrow. Might not. I know it did yesterday, but similarly, George Berkeley, I know it's spelled Berkeley, but it's pronounced Berkeley, also an ultimate skeptic. And he's the guy that you've heard about because he thought that maybe sensible qualities exist only when there's something to perceive it. So he's the guy that said, a tree falls in the forest, and if there's no one there to hear it, does it make a noise? And depending on how you define noise, you could say yes, or you could say no. Does it make a sound? Well, what is sound? If sound is what I perceive when something hits my ear, well, if there are no ears there to hear it, then no, it doesn't make a sound. But if sound is a series of vibrations of air molecules against each other, you got a different question, but different answer there. So he was, questioning everything. And then there's John Locke, who's definitely the hero of all this. Notice that he's also the oldest, right? So he dies in 1704, well before Berkeley and before Hume's even born. And he is the one that has had the biggest influence on civilization and on the world. He came from a relatively poor family. He was not an aristocrat. These were in the days when most scholars were people who think of Isaac Newton, right? How did he have so much time to while away the hours and do whatever he wanted? Because he was rich. He inherited a whole bunch of money, and he never had to work a day in his life. Neither did Darwin, right? Darwin got to be such a great naturalist, right? I mean, he's definitely one of my heroes, but the man never had to work a day in his life. And not only that, not only was he born rich, then he marries someone and she's even richer than he is, right? And that's just how it was. Right? Locke, on the other hand, had to make his way in the world. And apparently he was pretty intelligent. So school offered a way for him to make his way in the world. And virtually everything you think you know about government and about democracy, he thought of it first. He's the guy that said, you know what? It's not just kings and queens who have a right to decide what to do. The people who are being governed have rights too. And this very notion that people should only be governed by people that the people approve of, right? That there's a certain right as someone who's being governed to have a say in what happens to you. Totally radical idea. And everything you think you know about the founding fathers, the American Revolution, they all read Locke. They all knew Locke frontwards and backwards, right? They'd grown up on that stuff. And that definitely got them thinking about why should King George be in charge of anything. And Locke, too, wrote enough about those things that for a while he decided it might be safer to live in the Netherlands for a while. It might not be safe to stick around too long in England, but eventually came back. And his most famous contribution was to insist that all information has to come in through the senses. And he, think about this, a self-made man who's questioning whether royalty should get to be in charge of everything, right? He claimed that people don't enter the world with, the right to rule or the right to anything, or with any ideas, that people enter the world with a mind that he likened to a blank piece of paper. And he never used this term, blank slate or tabula rasa in Latin, but other people did. And that's very much the idea he was talking about. You come into the world and your mind is totally empty, and the only way to put something in there is through the senses. And, he talked about that a lot. And so he rejected the idea of innate ideas, the idea really that we come into the world understanding the Pythagorean theorem. Come on, Plato, what are you smoking, right? This, or that we come into the world and we already know what's right and wrong. Again, Descartes, nice guy, but that can't be right, right? So that was important for him. So he rejected the idea of innate ideas, and believe it or not, we'll run into innate ideas again several chapters from now. And it's right now, it's so distressing to me. There, in the neuroscience literature, there's this big increase in people talking about innate behaviors. And I'll have a rant about that later. But it's definitely in the air now. People want to talk about innate ideas. And it's like, have you read Locke? You know, how this is not new stuff. But there we are. So this idea of a tabula rasa, and there is one particular passage, and yeah, I'm gonna read it to you, even though it's out there on the screen. I just, in part because, first of all, it's 17th century, right? So this has been out there a while. But I want you to notice that it's perfectly understandable English, right? Even if it's a little off-putting, right? And he talks about this problem that came to be known as Molyneaux' problem, because he heard about it from a correspondent named Molyneaux who put it to him. And before I read it to you, I want to point out several things about it. One is, well, first, make your own decision. I'm going to ask you a question in a minute. Okay. To which purpose I shall here insert a problem with that very ingenious and studious promoter of real knowledge. You got to love the build-up. The learned and worthy Mr. Molyneaux, which he was pleased to send me in a letter some months since. And it is this. Suppose a man born blind and now adult and taught by his touch to distinguish between a cube and a sphere of the same metal and nearly the same bigness, so as to tell when he felt one and the other which is the cube and which the sphere. Suppose then that the cube and the sphere placed on the table and the blind man be made to see. Query, whether by his sight before he touched them, he could now distinguish and tell which is the globe, which is the cube. Anyone want to argue whether he will or will not and tell us why? What do you think? He's been around cubes and spheres all of his life. He hasn't seen them, but he's felt them, right? So now suddenly the image is going on his eyes. Is he going to be able to tell which is which? Anyone want? Yeah, Laura, what do you think?
I would say yes. I think my best about it, but it's united points.
Yeah, exactly. The pointy ends, exactly. I couldn't have paid you to ask a better question. Anyone want to take the opposite point of view? I don't know, Evan?
Yeah, I don't think you would either this with the gifts. They would know what a sharp edge feels like. They wouldn't know what that sharp edge looks.
It's like I planted to people. Yeah, and he and Molyneaux say the same thing, right? So, to which the acute and judicious proposer, okay, more blowing smoke up his butt, answers, not. You thought that was a new thing, right? When somebody negates something and they just say, not. No. Molyneaux came up with that first. Not. For though he has obtained the experience of how a globe, how a cube affects his touch, yet he has not yet obtained the experience, as Evan pointed out, that what affects his touch so or so must affect his sight so or so, or that a protuberant angle that you were talking about, the edges of the cube, in the cube that pressed his hand unequally shall appear to his eye as it does in the cube. And he says, and now we're back to Locke. I agree with this thinking gentleman, whom I'm proud to call my friend, in his answer to this problem. And am of the opinion that the blind man at first sight would not be able with certainty to say which was the globe, which the cube, whilst he only saw them, though could unerringly name them by touch, and certainly distinguish them by the difference of the figures felt. This I have set down and leave with my reader as an occasion for him to consider how much he may be beholden to experience, improvement, and acquired notions, right? This is a guy that thinks, you get molded by life, right? Experience and acquired notions. That's where he came from, where he thinks he had not the least use of them or help for them. And then he says, and the rather, and we just saw this unfold, right? And the rather, because this observing gentleman further adds, Having upon the occasion of my book proposed this to diverse, very ingenious men, he hardly ever met with one that at first gave the answer to which he thinks true, till by hearing his reasons, they were convinced. In other words, most people say, your first thought is, sure, he'll be able to see, he'll be able to tell them apart. And then you ask him some more, and you say, well, how would he know what a protuberant angle looks like? Oh, well, okay, no, he wouldn't be able to tell them. But what's left unsaid in this, but I think is pretty clearly implied, is both Locke and Molyneaux think that eventually the man will be able to use his sight to distinguish cubes and spheres, right? That's pretty clear. To which I say, not. Okay. And we're gonna explore that some more. So, and here's just a picture showing the idea. And although Locke didn't do it, the other big philosophical point that Plato was making was, how do we perceive things, right? How do we know what something is? Talks about a bed. You know, there's an infinite number of beds. I've seen lots of beds. No two are alike. And yet you show me a bed and I'll know instantly what it is. And he said, well, how can you recognize it as being a bed if it doesn't quite fit any other beds you've seen before? It must be that you had the idea of a bed in your head in the first place, his Platonic ideal form of a bed, and that what you're doing is you're noticing how closely it does or does not come to resemble the form of the bed, the perfect bed that's in your head. Or we could talk about dogs. One of the reasons Darwin was so fascinated about dogs is because people have managed to change their morphology so enormously in the blink of an eye, evolutionarily speaking, right? Almost overnight. Here are all these dogs, and they all look different, and yet none of you would have any difficulty recognizing instantly that is a dog. That's the perfect form of a dog. And these days, psychologists don't really cotton to the idea of a Platonic form. Rather, they point out that as we go through the world and we keep encountering different dogs and keep classifying them as we go, oh, that's a dog, it's not a cat, right? That's not a cow, that's a dog, right? That as we go through life, seeing more and more examples of dogs, that we build up a prototype, a cognitive average of what all dogs look like. So that when we see a dog that's a totally new breed we've never seen before, we instantly know it's a dog, right? We don't have to reason about it. Well, okay, yeah, there are those stories. Maybe that's a really big rat and not a chihuahua. But you get the idea, right? You'd soon figure it out. And, for psychologists, that prototype can only be built up from experience. If you've never seen a dog before, you won't know what it is. If you've never seen any dog, you won't know what to call it. Even if people have described to you what a dog is, right? You wouldn't instantly recognize it as such. And so it's this psychological idea that we go through life constantly averaging the images of things we see to get an idea of what things are supposed to be like, right? And mostly people talk about prototypes of images, but you can think of other sorts of prototypes, like what's a fruit and what's a vegetable, right? I mean, did anyone, right, tell you this is a fruit, this is a vegetable? Well, probably so, but and don't bother me with the tomatoes are really fruits. Okay, yeah, I understand. I mean, that just shows you how fuzzy the concept really is. And yet you all have in your mind an idea of what's a fruit and a vegetable, and it's a totally made up human idea. And yet you'd mostly classify them right. Even if I showed you a new thing, and well, you think this is a fruit or a vegetable, you make, almost all of you make a pretty good guess, right? And again, human imposed. Oh, what was the other example? Oh, and there's also a lot about prototypes in language, right? That as we come to understand language, that we're constantly, putting together prototypes of sentences we hear, et cetera, to figure out how they're supposed to be put together. And that indeed you came into the world with a mind that was able to do that without anybody giving you explicit instruction. And almost everyone manages to do it. Another place where I think Platonic ideas about our prototypes play a role is in faces. So this is, thing that people have done several times. I want you to notice all these men's faces, young men's faces, and, you may have opinions about which are attractive and which aren't, et cetera. But these days with computers, you can average all these faces together and you get a face like this. So if in fact I'm going through life looking at men's faces and I'm remembering them a little bit and I'm keeping a running average of what men's faces look like, if I were doing that and I had that sort of concept, that prototype in my head, this is what it would look like. And lo and behold, most people find this face very attractive. More attractive than any of the faces that went into it. Well, who taught you that that's an attractive male face? Right? Nobody. But if in fact you've been averaging men's faces all of your life, this is going to come as close to looking what that average would look like as anything you're going to see. And in human sexuality, we'll talk about how evolution says that any face that's this symmetrical must be carrying some pretty good genes, right? So that runs into it too. And I didn't do it for women's faces, but believe me, you see the same thing when you average women's faces. And the more people's faces you average, the more attractive the face looks. And the prototype for an attractive male face is very different than the prototype for an attractive female face. Who taught us how to distinguish between what's attractive in a male face, square jaw, and what's attractive in a female face, less square jaw, right? Softer angles down there, etc. Well, nobody. So did we just pick up that idea about what's attractive in the two sexes because society taught us, oh, she's attractive and she's not? Or have we been averaging faces already? And I'll tell you that as soon as newborns come out of mom, one of the things they spend the most time looking at is anything that has a configuration of a face. Babies are fascinated by faces or circles that have two eyes in them, right? More than any other arbitrary object you can put together, they want to look at those things. And they're paying very careful attention to them from the start. And so maybe they're building up a prototype. My point is, here are some ideas that behave like Plato's forms, and yet they have been constructed through sensory experience, just like Locke told you they had to be. So I told you Plato and Descartes were right, and Locke comes around and says they're full of hooey, and I'm telling you Locke is right too. And what's going to happen in the rest of this course is we're going to look at all the ways in which experience, neural activity first, and then sensory experience, is not only playing a role in putting the nervous system together, but it's absolutely crucial. You cannot make a nervous system that works unless you feed it sensory experience early in life. We'll see that time and time again. And think back on that a long time ago, natural selection hit upon this way of making a really complex nervous system without having to pack all that information into the genome. And when did natural selection start relying on sensory experience to help put together a nervous system that works? Well, at least as far back as our common ancestor with sea slugs. Because as we're going to see, the mechanisms that neuroscience has discovered about how sensory experience could alter the structure of the nervous system, the basic mechanisms are also present in sea slugs. Or step back and have another perspective. It's really useful to learn, right? Right? There's things that happen in the world, and if you can learn from it, you're more likely to live long enough to reproduce.
Right.
And there's no way you can make a creature that's capable of learning unless sensory experience can change the structure of its nervous system, right? That's the whole end-all, be-all of learning. Okay. Questions about that? And then the epilogue at the end of the book will explain how it is I can tell you Plato and Descartes were all absolutely correct, and that Locke contradicted them, and he was absolutely correct. And then we're going to talk about Immanuel Kant, who said, they're both right, and he was absolutely correct too. Okay? And my conceit is that these philosophers, they were wrestling with big problems, right? How do we come into the world? How do we get here? What's directing us to what we're going to do and how we're going to live our lives? How do we think the thoughts we think, right? How does that? These are big questions, right? And none of them knew anything about neurons. I mean, Plato didn't even know that the brain had anything to do with behavior, right? He thought it was all in the heart. So they knew nothing about neurons or how the brain puts itself together. But in fact, they were wrestling with the questions that I started you with, which is, you began life as a cell, a fertilized egg, so small you could barely see it, and you made the most complicated machine in the universe between your ears. Right? How does that happen? That's a big problem, right? So I think that the rationalist philosophers, I think they were developmental neurobiologists. They just didn't know it. And Locke, when he comes along, he's a developmental neurobiologist too. And when we talk to him about Immanuel Kant, yeah, you can argue, he was a developmental neurobiologist too. They were all wrestling with the same problem that we've been wrestling with in this class, which is, how do you put together a nervous system that's that complex that it works? And we're going to be giving answers in terms of neurons and growth cones and synapses and things like that, but we're wrestling with the very same problems they had. So the philosophers were accidental developmental neurobiologists, and in the meantime, especially in the 20th century, there have been all these developmental neurobiologists who don't know anything about philosophy, who never heard of any of that crap. And they don't know it. They think they're working with neurons and synapses and stuff like that, but they're actually philosophers. They are tackling the same problems that the philosophers been tackling for, going on 2,000 years. Okay, so enough of that. Let's have a Kahoot. How are we doing for time?
No, but and that's
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the one from the TEDx talk, right? Okay. So, raised by grandparents. That's a long story too. Lived on a farm till I was 10, and I feel, and apparently, before I can remember, one of the things I liked to do the best was to walk around the farm with an empty coffee can and gather bugs and put them in there. And as long as I can remember, I've known which wasps sting and which ones don't, right? So I learned that easy and early. And of course, I was fascinated with animals, chickens, and we had pigs and cows, etc. And so when I'm about 6 years old, before I'm in school, I asked my grandmother, where do these calves come from that are out there? And she explains it to me. Very clear-headed, rational. See, the cow goes out in the field, and then she turns over rocks until she finds one that's got a calf under it. Right? It's the Ozarks version of the Cabbage Patch, right? Well, yeah, okay. That makes as much sense as water falling from the sky, right? Okay. I mean, anything's possible when you're this. And what hung me up is I couldn't figure out how the cow, I know how cows work. They can't move their hooves side. How was a cow doing? Was it like picking up the rock and backing up? I mean, I just couldn't picture it, right? So I'm totally, a nerd already. And then it turns out cows, when they're going to give birth, they often go hide, right? Leftover way of approaching predators. And what my grandmother would do is when a cow was close to giving birth, she'd put it in the barn every night, and then the next morning let it out to go forage, etc. And one time I happened to go with her. I'm 6 years old, and I know where calves come from. She opens up I'm waiting for the bus. She opens up the door, and I don't know how that happened. And here's this tableau. There's the cow. I still see it on her back. Her head's facing this way. And there's this bloody, slimy trail coming from her rear end up to this calf that's standing there wobbling, looking at me. And it's also covered in slime and blood. And it's like, Grandma, did the calf come from there? And after a beat, she said, no. And I said nothing. 6 years old, but it was a big wake-up call, right? I adored this woman. I trusted her entirely, and she would lie to me. I mean, it was just so obvious she was lying. And I do think that set me on a pathway of being being on the farm got me interested in animal behavior. And that experience really made me kind of a pain in the neck of a kid for the rest of my life because I didn't believe anything anybody told me. And that's great preparation being a scientist, right? Okay. So to get back to a bigger lesson, in each of those cases, I think that experience did indeed had an effect on your behavior afterwards. And I'll just remind you, you're a neuroscientist. That means that experience changed the structure of your brain in some way, altered synapses, either the strength or the number, something somewhere. It had to be something physical because I don't have any time to talk about demons or spirits. It did something physical to your brain that affected what would happen, what you'd do next time, etc. And here's the thing. You didn't just have one of those experiences. You had hundreds of them. Hundreds. Some of which you don't remember anymore because it's not, that important to, and in each of those cases, you did not choose to have that experience, right? The universe conspired to alter your brain in that particular way without your consent and without your having any say in it. And that means that I could come up with 1,000 cloned babies. They're all have exactly the same genotype after every one of them. And I scatter them around the world, and they have different experiences at different times. And no two of them will have a brain as an adult that's the same, right? And Locke would have explained it to you. There's no way their brains are different, that one's a mathematician, right? And that one's a pediatrician, and that one's a physical therapist. There's no way that would have happened except they were gathering information through the senses. Okay, but this is supposed to be a neuroscience course, not a philosophy course. So what we're going to spend the rest of the class talking about is how neural activity decides which synapses come and go. And that happens before the sensory organs are even working. So there is no sensation because there's no sensory organ yet. And yet already neural activity, whether an action potential comes, whether the synapse is active or not, that's going to have an impact on how the nervous system develops. And once natural selection came up with that mechanism, letting neural activity alter the structure of the nervous system, it was just a matter of time before some of those neurons that are altering activity happen to be sensory neurons. And so they're responding not spontaneously, but in response to the world around them. And then by the time we get to chapter 10, we're going to see that once nervous systems start getting put together based on sensory experiences that happen, then we're going to see this enormous divide where there are two groups of animals on this planet that exploited that enormously. And they're the ones that happen to have the largest brains per body size of any other species on the planet. And those two groups of animals are birds and mammals. And how did they manage to make so much more complex nervous systems? Not coincidentally, they're the ones in which juvenile care is absolutely crucial. It's obligatory, right? Oh, so now you've got conspecifics. Not only has sensory experience been molding your brain, but now you've got conspecifics who are shoving information into your brain. Some of it absolutely crucial to survive, and some of it absolutely crucial to reproduce. And so that will get us to the end of the book, okay? All right, so off you go. Be calm, stay good.